Episode 2. The Last Word on the Tombstone. In the town of Greystone, life moved slowly and unevenly. The sun never fully rose, and the streetlights flickered even during the day. People here didn't talk much, but they could discuss a lost object for days, because in Greystone everything had meaning, but some things never had an explanation. At the edge of town stood a small shop. On its door, a single word was written: stonemason. The owner of the shop was Elliot Ward, 34 years old. His job was carving the last words for the dead. Elliot rose early each morning. His tea was strong, his jacket pressed, his schedule perfectly organized. Every tombstone order was carefully documented. Names were double-checked. Dates of death were confirmed a third time because the dead were silent, but intolerant of typos. That day began like any other. His tea was steaming. An old man collecting trash on the street was whistling. Elliot opened his computer. There was a new message in his inbox from lucien.reeves93@duskmail.org. Subject: Custom Order, Special Design. When Elliot opened the email, a cold wave ran through his body, because what he saw written was his own name. Order form: stone type, gray granite. Name: Elliot Ward. Date of death: November 17th, 2024. Last word: do not look. Elliot sat frozen at his desk. He thought it was a joke, but then he noticed the date. Today was November 10th. The tombstone was to be finished exactly 1 week from now. His first thought was that this was some elaborate prank from his father, but his father had died 5 years ago. Elliot had carved the tombstone himself. He clicked the sender's address. Server: duskmail.org. He had never heard of it before. He searched it on Google. No results. The domain didn't exist. It was as if it had opened briefly and vanished. With trembling fingers, Elliot typed a reply. Hello. I believe this order was sent to the wrong person. My name is Elliot Ward, and I am very much alive. Could you please clarify? He hit send. No response. Hours passed. Then, the screen froze. His mouse stopped working. Just as he reached to unplug the power, the screen went black. Then, gray. And in the center of the screen, a single word appeared: accepted. Elliot didn't sleep that night. His eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling. He couldn't quiet his thoughts. The idea of carving his own death gnawed at his mind. But something stirred inside him. A pull. Maybe a curiosity stronger than denial. Maybe a strange way to prepare for death. In the morning, he went down to the workshop. He began selecting the stone. To craft his own tombstone, he chose the hardest slab he had. He trimmed the edges, smoothed the surface, picked up his chisel. He carved the name first, Elliot, then the last name, then the date. With every strike, it felt like a sound was rising, not from the stone, but from within his own mind. The hammer wasn't hitting stone, it was striking thought, and when he reached the final word, his hand didn't hesitate. He carved Donotlook. When he finished, the workshop's large clock stopped. 3:17. At the exact same moment, his phone vibrated. No calls, no notifications. But the screen went dark, and a new message appeared. The stone is complete. Now, only time remains. Elliot stood by the tombstone for a long time. It was the cleanest work he'd ever done. But he didn't feel fear. He felt something else: anticipation. And from that night on, the town's cats stopped going near the workshop. Elliot woke up early, though calling it sleep would be generous. His eyes had closed, but his mind was caught on the word carved into the stone. Donotlook. Every night he read a few pages before bed, but that night it was as if the same letters appeared at the start of each paragraph, one by one. Donotlook. Instead of going to his workshop with coffee in hand, Elliot walked to the small archive building in the center of Greystone. Greystone Archives, a cold, stone structure, dark, silent. But when Elliot was a child, he used to spend time there with his grandfather. Back then, they jokingly called it the Dusty Story Library. When he stepped inside, the old clerk looked up. "Ward? Been a while since I've seen you here." Elliot gave a nod. He got straight to the point. "Do you have any records of Lucien A. Reeves?" The clerk thought for a moment, then reached for an old registry book. He flipped through its yellowed pages and stopped. "Yes, the Reeves family lived here about 100 years ago, but only one member is buried here. Lucien Alexander Reeves." Elliot felt a chill run down his spine. "Does the grave have a headstone?" The clerk nodded slowly. "Back parcel, one of the oldest sections, but the stone is strange. The inscription seems incomplete." Elliot thanked him, but as he turned to leave, the clerk called out, "Elliot, your grandfather worked with the Reeves family. They carved some of their stones together. Might be something in your grandfather's old chest." That afternoon, Elliot unlocked the basement storage of his workshop. Inside, old chisels, engraving heads, stone molds, and among them, a thin black notebook. On the cover, just 3 letters, R.A.L. He opened it. Inside were notes written in fine, neat handwriting. His grandfather had documented each tombstone designed for the Reeves family, but the last page was different. There was a sketch for Lucien A. Reeves's stone, but one line was missing. Last word. It was underlined, but the space had been left blank. Elliot closed the notebook and made a decision. He needed to see the grave with his own eyes. The next morning, he went to the oldest section of Greystone Cemetery. The grass had been overtaken by wild weeds. Some stones had toppled over, others were thick with moss. But the headstone of Lucien Reeves stood firm, gray granite, the same kind of stone Elliot had used. The inscription read, "Lucien Alexander Reeves, 1862, 1912, and just beneath it, barely etched into the stone, nearly invisible, Donotlook. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. It was the exact same word he had carved into his own tombstone. Same style, same placement, same word. But this stone had stood here for over 100 years. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't coincidence. And then he saw something else, right near the bottom of the headstone, just above the worn earth. A faint line. Elliot knelt down, brushed away the dirt with his fingers, and read, "Engraved by Elliot Ward." Elliot fell back. This wasn't possible. He had engraved his own name on the tombstone of a man buried a century ago, and he had done it yesterday. But the stone had already been here. Elliot sat for hours in front of Reeves's tombstone. He had carved the name with his own hands. But the stone had stood here for over a century. This couldn't be a mistake, not a prank, not a coincidence. It could only mean one thing. Someone knew what Elliot would do, and had written it on a stone in the past. But who was that someone? And the real question, when had Elliot begun? That night, he didn't go home. He spent the night in the basement of his workshop, among his grandfather's old belongings. He reopened the notebook, and this time, he noticed an envelope tucked tightly between the pages. It wasn't just stored there. It had been hidden, as if someone didn't want it found, but still meant for it to be discovered. Inside the envelope were 2 things. 1, a yellowed photograph. 2, and an old pocket watch stopped at 3:17. He examined the photograph carefully. It was black and white. The date written on it, 1912. In the photo stood a stonemason. In the background, the old version of his workshop. Stones, chisels, notes scratched on the walls. Elliot stopped asking questions, because every piece said the same thing. This story began before you ever did. But whether it ends is up to you. The next morning, Elliot decided to visit the oldest living resident of Greystone, Mrs. Alcott, 97 years old, yet still sharp as glass, a living legend. When Elliot knocked on her door, she greeted him as if she had been waiting. She didn't ask why he came. She didn't look surprised. She simply invited him in. "You've come at last," she said. Just like him. Same eyes, same silence. Elliot couldn't hold it in anymore. "Like who? What do you know?" Mrs. Alcott removed her glasses. "Lucian's master? Wasn't your grandfather. It was you." Elliot flinched. Her voice had softened, slowed, but each word carried weight. "You were here. And when you began carving stones, things changed. The town grew quieter, and those who came after 3:17 were never the same again. Reeves wasn't just a name. He was part of a chain, and like all who followed its shadow, he fell silent." Elliot pulled out the photograph. "This man is me." "But how?" "This was taken in 1912. Mrs. Alcott lowered her head. "Time doesn't always break. Sometimes it folds into itself. And sometimes a mason carves his final stone for himself." That night, Elliot returned to the workshop. He stood once more before the tombstone he had carved. The letters were still sharp. Elliot Ward, November 17th, 2024. Do not look. But then, he saw something new. A mark that hadn't been there that morning. A fresh engraving just below his name. He hadn't carved it. It read, "Second stone complete. You're next." Since the moment Elliot noticed the new line on the stone, he hadn't left the workshop. Though he hadn't carved it, the handwriting was his. Sharp, measured, precise. Just like the hundreds of names he'd etched before. But this had happened without him. That night, Elliot decided to stay in the workshop. He placed a chair in front of the stone, a thermos in one hand, flashlight in the other. He never turned the light off. But as the hours passed, the light itself seemed to fade. It was as if the workshop was slowly being pulled into shadow. At exactly 3:17, Elliot had begun to drift off. Eyes half open, thoughts flickering. And in that moment, he heard something. It came from the surface of the stone. A soft scraping sound. Not metal, but something being slowly carved. He jolted upright, shined the flashlight on the stone. The line from earlier was still there. Second stone complete. You're next. But just beneath it, a new line had begun to form. Not yet finished, but he could make out the first two letters. L. U. Elliot placed his hand on the stone. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It felt alive. Under his fingertips, he could feel a faint, pulsing energy, like a heartbeat. And then, he felt a change in the air behind him. Someone was there. He turned slowly. The workshop was empty. The door, still locked. The windows, cracked but unmoving. No wind, no sound. And then, a chisel fell from the workbench. Nothing had touched it, but it landed right at Elliot's feet. He turned back to the chair, but before sitting down, he noticed a piece of paper on the floor. It hadn't been there before. It was dirty, folded, but still legible. On it, a name, Lucien A. Reeves, and beneath that, an address, Plot 9B, Cemetery Archive Vault. There were old rumors that beneath Greystone Cemetery lay hidden vaults, unmarked in official records. Some said older sections lay buried underneath existing graves. Elliot waited until sunrise, then grabbed his flashlight and an old pickaxe and walked to the cemetery. Plot 9B was just a few meters from Reeves's stone, beside a decaying stone cross. He began to dig. On the second strike, his pick hit stone. He cleared the dirt and revealed a small rotating hatch. He lifted it. A narrow stairway led downward. The vault was airless. But once inside, there was light, not from any lamp, but from the walls themselves. A faint, pale blue glow, as if the stones were lighting themselves from within. And directly ahead stood a coffin, dusty, metal, rust-covered, but on its surface, no name, no dates, just two words, "Not yet." As Elliot approached, his footsteps made no sound. It was as if the floor absorbed it, as if sound had no permission here. With each step, the air grew, thicker, quieter, more alive. When he stood before the coffin, he reached out his hand, and the moment he touched it, it trembled. From inside, a voice whispered, "I've been waiting for you, Elliot." The voice from inside the coffin didn't echo. It didn't bounce off the vault walls. It rang directly inside Elliot's mind, clear, cold, and not a whisper, but a command. "I've been waiting for you, Elliot." Elliot took a step back, but he couldn't take his eyes off the coffin. The lid was slightly ajar now, but the inside wasn't just dark. It was absent of light. He shone his flashlight inside. The beam didn't enter. It was swallowed. Then he noticed the ceiling. Old carvings stretched across the stone above, hundreds of them. Names, dates, and one word, DONOTLOOK, again and again, as if every grave had been sealed with this word. Then the voice returned. "Here is your first question. Did you carve the stone?" Elliot couldn't speak, but something in his mind shifted. "Yes, but I don't know why." The voice continued. "He who carves the stone shapes time. Each letter is the echo of an event, but every word is a command." Elliot took a deep breath. He placed his fingers on the coffin lid and slowly opened it. Inside was a body, but it wasn't dead. Lucian Reeves, eyes closed, chest rising and falling, breathing for over a century. Resting on his chest, a stone tablet with 3 carved words: "Wait, carve, finish." Lucian's eyes suddenly opened, completely black, but inside them, dots of light shimmered, like stars, as if they held a map of time. This time, Elliot didn't step back. He only asked, "Who am I?" Lucien answered, "You are the final mason, not just a link in the chain, but the lock itself. When the stone is finished, the door will open." At that moment, the vault walls began to tremble. It was as if all the carvings were vibrating at once. A low hum spread through the chamber, like the murmuring of names. Hundreds, maybe thousands of voices, grave after grave, unsealed. And they all whispered the same sentence: "Do not look, but do not stop." Lucian sat up in the coffin. He didn't stand, but his eyes were locked onto Elliot's. "To end time, you must first write it." Elliot asked, "What will I write?" Lucian slowly pointed to a blank stone at the far end of the chamber, untouched, smooth, unmarked. Beside it lay a chisel. "The final name is not yours, but you will be the one to write it." That night, when Elliot returned to his workshop, something had changed. Cracks had formed in the walls. One chisel set was missing, and the stone with the word "Do not look" was now cracked. A new line had appeared across it. Not yet. Elliot didn't wait for morning. When he returned to the workshop, the sky was still black, but the stone was already awake. The words "not yet" were gone. In their place, a new line had been carved, Place prepared, no name. Beside the original stone stood a new, untouched headstone block. Elliot hadn't ordered it, but he recognized the granite. It was called Silent Stone, a rare material harvested from beneath lake beds. Only master stonemasons were ever given access to it. Elliot had never even seen it up close, until now. The block had no tool marks, but its surface still felt fresh, as if someone had placed it there only moments ago. Elliot reached for the chisel on his table, but his hand trembled, because this time he didn't know the name. He had no idea what to carve, and yet his fingers began moving on their own. Lara, woman's name. But Elliot didn't know anyone by it. He had never heard it before. Still, he continued carving. On the second line, his hand stopped, to be buried, and then blank, as if the stone itself was waiting for a decision, an unfinished fate. Just then, a bell rang from outside, the funeral bell. In Greystone, it rang only when someone had truly died, and only for the living. Elliot rushed outside. Down the street stood Thomas, the old man who rang the church bell. "Who died?" Elliot asked, out of breath. But Thomas didn't reply. He only pointed toward the lake. A grave opened, but no one saw the body. Elliot reached the lake just as the sun began to rise, but the water was perfectly still, no waves, no sound, as if it wasn't water, but time itself pooled on the surface. At the edge of the shore, he saw the remains of a fresh dig. The soil was still damp, recently opened, and just as quickly sealed again. But space had been left, room for a stone, clearly intentional. And the stone was gone. Elliot returned to the workshop. It was empty. The stone was missing. The chisel lay on the ground, and on the wall, a black stain, like soot, shaped like a human hand. Above the door, scratched in red, Lara. The elders of Greystone began to gather. The first to arrive was Mrs. Alcott. Then came the church caretaker, the retired gravedigger, even Matthew, who never spoke a word. They stood silently outside Elliot's workshop, until one of them said, "We can't stay silent anymore, because the stone has started to speak." Elliot asked what was happening. An old man whispered, "Lara, she was our past, but your future. She was never buried, only hidden." Elliot walked to the cemetery once again, but not the old section this time. He went toward the forbidden side, by the lake. That part had been closed off for decades. Officially, no tombstones had ever been placed there, but there were stories that those buried there were laid to rest so that no one would remember their names. Elliot approached a nameless grave, and his eyes welled up, because the soil was still warm, and from beneath it, a newly carved stone began to slowly rise. Lara Hemmings D. Nitten Hundratagtu E. Scene 317. The third line didn't list a death date, it said scene. This wasn't a grave marker, it was a declaration, a record of witness. When Elliot touched the stone, it spoke, not out loud, but like a breath in his mind. "I'm still here." The whisper that rose from the stone echoed in Elliot's mind, but it wasn't a voice, it was a memory, as if a sentence lived long ago had finally been spoken aloud. Elliot went to Greystone's old library to search for the name Lara Hemmings. Dusty shelves, pages rustling in the wind, a corridor made of silence, yearbooks, death certificates, birth records, but no mention of Lara. Only a newspaper clipping from 1902. The headline read, "Teacher Missing, Last Seen at the Lake." The article said, "Lara Hemmings, the new teacher at Greystone Town School, disappeared on the night of October 27, 1902. She was last seen at lakefront at exactly 3:17 a.m. Since then, no word has been heard from her." No official funeral was held, but her family requested a stone be placed in her name. The request was denied. When Elliot left the library, the sky was iron gray once again. The lake was different than usual. It wasn't waveless anymore, but it wasn't moving either, as if it was breathing, slow, quiet, and aware. That night, Elliot made a decision. He would leave behind the stones, the past, the crypt, and walk into the lake, because Lara was there, and her story hadn't been buried. It had been left unfinished. The stillest hour of night, 3:16 a.m. As Elliot stepped onto the lake's shore, the wind had stopped. The trees were silent, no birds, no frogs, only his own breath. Moonlight touched the lake's surface, but there was no reflection, because the lake had stopped reflecting. 3:17. Elliot leaned toward the water. He threw a stone, but it didn't splash. It passed straight through the surface and vanished. Then he heard a whisper behind him, but this time it was familiar. Elliot. He turned around. No one. But when he looked back at the lake, there was a silhouette in the water, a woman, wearing a pure white dress, jet black hair, unmoving, and her eyes were open. Elliot stepped into the lake. The water wasn't cold, but it wasn't real either. It felt made of time. With each step, his feet remained visible beneath him, and Lara's silhouette became clearer. Finally, she spoke. "No one ever wrote me. I had no stone. That's why I never left." Elliot fell to his knees. Tears streamed from his eyes. "I'll write you," he said. "I'll bury you, but I won't forget you." Lara bowed her head. From beneath the water she handed him something, a stone plaque, her name carved into it. Lara Hemmings teacher, 1902. The lake doesn't stay silent. Elliot took the stone, but the moment he touched it, the lake turned dark. The moonlight vanished, and the wind returned, not like a storm, more like a sigh. The lake had let something go. By morning, the villagers found him at the lake's edge. Elliot was kneeling alone in the muddy, stony shore, holding a piece of stone, and on the ground, carved into the earth, were the words, "Buried, remembered. She can pass now." After he was found at the lake's edge that morning, Elliot didn't speak to anyone. The villagers walked him home, but his eyes met no one's. He clutched the piece of stone in his hand, tightly, as if letting go would make everything start again. When he returned home, he didn't enter the workshop, because carving stone was no longer a craft. It was a prophecy. Lara's name was now on a stone, but the lake had left him one last thing, an empty gravestone. No name, no date, just a single scratch, a 3-letter gap. Elliot thought for days. Who was it for? When would it be filled? Then he went down into the old crypt. He looked once more at Lucian's coffin. This time, it was empty. But the plaque had changed. The last to come is the first to forget, but the first to write is the last to remain. Elliot finally picked up the chisel again. He stood in front of the blank stone, bent down slowly, and began carving the letters ELLIOT. The line below, remembered at 0317. But this was not an obituary. It was an ending, a closing sentence. When he finished the stone, the workshop trembled once again. Dust fell from the walls, and from all the old stones a faint hum rose, a single whisper spoken in unison. Completed. That night, at exactly 3:17, Elliot was in bed, but he was awake. His window was open, and from outside came the sound of a bell. That same old bell, but this time, no one had died, because this sound was not for mourning, but for closure. The next morning, when the villagers came to the workshop, Elliot was gone, but a letter lay on the table. I'm not leaving. I've just stopped writing. From now on, no name will be forgotten without being buried. Lara was remembered. The lake is silent. At the bottom, a single line. The last word on a gravestone is not always a name. Sometimes it's just silence. From that day on, the lake returned to its stillness. When the clock struck 3:17, nothing happened. No sound was heard. Because now, everyone was where they were meant to be. And in Greystone, every gravestone from then on began to include a final line. Unofficial, yet understood by all. Remembered.